been speaking of a project of how to promote literature, how to invite writers and things like that, and we thought it would be important to end the day here, leaving the words to the writers. Since Rousseau was not invitable today, we thought we would ask an actress, Rachel Gordy, who is an actress living in Geneva, to read a few texts from writers who either lived in Geneva, wrote about Geneva, or currently live nearby Geneva. She'll read different texts, she'll always introduce the authors, but just want to make you aware that, for example, Jorge Borges, the Argentinian writer, died in Geneva, and he actually lived a few blocks away in this same street. So if you go that way, you'll see the sign, "Here lived Borges." So she'll read a piece of him, and also a piece of John Berger, who is an English-speaking writer who lived in France, but really close by. So you'll end with him, right?
Yeah.
So the final word will be to a living writer.
They still exist. Right? So, hello everybody. I'm going to actually start with Borges, a piece from his Atlas about Geneva. Of all the cities in the world, of all the homelands that a man seeks to earn, Geneva seems to me to be the most likely to bring happiness. Thanks to her, I discovered since 1914 French, Latin, German, Expressionism, Schopenhauer, the doctrines of Buddha, Taoism, Conrad, Lafcadio Hearn, and nostalgia for Buenos Aires. Also love, friendship, humiliation, and the siren call of suicide. Things remembered are always pleasant, even trials. These are personal reasons, but I can give a more general one. Unlike other cities, Geneva has no emphasis. Paris is not unaware that she is Paris. Benevolent London knows that she is London. Geneva, however, barely realizes that she is Geneva. Here are the towering shadows of Calvin, Rousseau, Amiel, and Ferdinand Audelaire, but no one speaks of them to the traveler passing through. Geneva, somewhat like Japan, has renewed herself without losing her past. Then we're going to go back in time a bit, and I've chosen a small part of a poem by Byron called The Prisoner of Chillon. Thank you. Lake Léman lies by Chillon's walls, 1,000 feet in depth below. Its massy waters meet and flow. Thus much the fathom line was sent from Chillon's snow-white battlement, which round about the wave enthralls. A double dungeon wall and wave have made, and like a living grave below the surface of the lake, the dark vault lies wherein we lie. We heard it ripple night and day, sounding o'er our heads it knocked, and I have felt the winter spray wash through the bars when winds were high and wanton in the happy sky. And then the very rock hath rocked, and I have felt it shake unshocked, because I could have smiled to see the death that would have set me free. And if there's Byron, there's obviously Shelley, Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear. The sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances. But they were days of a comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country. Who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake? Yet as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed around, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomily. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secheron, a village half a league to the east of the city. The sky was serene, and as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plainpalais. During this short voyage, I saw the lightnings playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing, I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. It advanced. The heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute, and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. It was echoed from Salève, the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then for an instant, everything seemed of a pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over that part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Belle-Rive and the village of Copé. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched the storm, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this is thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed that fair child. He was the murderer. I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Mont Salève, a hill that bounds Plainpalais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. We'll continue for pièce de résistance. The Reveries of the Solitary Walker by Rousseau, the fifth walk. Of all the places where I have lived, and I have lived in some charming ones, none has made me so truly happy or left me such sweet regrets as the Île de Saint-Pierre in the middle of the Lac de Bienne. This little island, which in Neuchâtel is called the Île de la Motte, is not at all well known, even in Switzerland. No traveler, as far as I know, has ever mentioned it. And yet, it is very pleasant and wonderfully situated for the happiness of a man who likes to live within defined limits. For, although I am perhaps the only person in the world to whom destiny has decreed that he should live in this way, I cannot believe that I am the only person to have such a natural inclination for it, although I have so far not come across it in anyone else. The shores of the Lac de Bienne are wilder and more romantic than those of Lake Geneva, because the rocks and woods are closer to the water's edge, but they are no less pleasing on the eye. There may be fewer cultivated fields and vineyards and fewer towns and houses, but there is also more natural greenery. There are more meadows and shaded woodland hideaways, and more frequent contrast and sudden changes in the landscape. Since there are no major roads suitable for carriages on these happy shores, the area is little visited by travelers. But how affecting it is for solitary contemplatives who love to lose themselves altogether in the charms of nature and to meditate in a silence unbroken by any sound other than that of the cry of eagles, occasional birdsong, and the rumbling of streams cascading down the mountains. In the middle of this beautiful, almost circular lake are two small islands. The one inhabited and cultivated, and about half a league in circumference, the other smaller, deserted, and lying fallow, which one day will end up being destroyed by the constant removal of earth from it to make good the damage done to the big island by waves and storms. Thus it is that the substance of the weak is always used to the advantages of the powerful. There is only one house on the island, but it is large, pleasant, and comfortable, and it belongs, as the island itself does, to the hospital in Bern and is inhabited by a steward who lives there with his family and servants. He keeps a well-stocked farmyard, an aviary, and fish ponds. For all its smallness, the island is so varied in soil and position that it has all kinds of places suitable for all sorts of things to be grown. It includes fields, vineyards, woodland, orchards, and rich pastures shaded by trees and lined by shrubs of all varieties, all of which are kept watered by the edges of the lake. A raised terrace, planted with 2 rows of trees, runs the length of the island, and in the middle of this terrace a pretty summer house has been built, where the inhabitants of the neighboring shores gather for dancing on Sundays during the grape harvest. It is on this island that I took refuge after the stoning at Moutier. I found staying there so charming, and I lived in a way so compatible with my nature, that resolving to end my days there, I had no concerns other than that I might not be allowed to carry out this plan, which conflicted with the plan to take me off to England, the first signs of which I was already beginning to detect. Troubled by these forebodings, I could have wished that this refuge would be turned into a lifelong prison, that I would be confined there for the rest of my life, and that by being stripped of all power and all hope of ever leaving, I would be forbidden any kind of communication with the mainland, so that, not knowing anything of what was going on in the outside world, I might forget its existence and it mine. I was barely allowed to spend 2 months on this island, but I could have spent 2 years, 2 centuries, and the whole of eternity there without for a moment becoming bored, or even though the only company I had there, apart from my companion, was the steward, his wife, and his servants, who were certainly all very good people, and nothing more. But this was precisely what I needed. I consider those 2 months to be the happiest time in my life. So happy, in fact, that it would have been enough for me to have lived like that for the whole of my life, without ever feeling in my soul the desire to live in any other state. So what was this happiness? And in what consisted its enjoyment? This would remain a mystery to all the men of this current age, were I to describe to them the life I led there. Precious farniente was of all the pleasures the first and foremost that I wished to enjoy in all its sweetness, and everything I did during my stay there was in fact nothing more than the delicious and necessary pastime of a man dedicated to idleness. The hope that no more would be required of me than to remain in this isolated place where I had willingly ensnared myself, which it was impossible for me to leave without help and without being seen, and where the only communication or correspondence I could have was through the people surrounding me, this hope in turn gave me the hope of finishing my days there more peacefully than I had lived. And the idea that I would have all the time I needed to settle in meant that, to begin with, I made no attempt to settle in at all. Having arrived there suddenly, alone and with nothing, I sent in turn for my companion, my books, and my few belongings, which I had the pleasure of not unpacking, leaving my boxes and trunks just as they were when they arrived, and living in the home in which I intended to end my days, as if it were an inn that I was supposed to leave the next day. Everything was going so well, as it was, that to try to arrange things better would have been to spoil them. One of my greatest pleasures was above all to leave my books boxed up and to have no writing at all. When wretched letters forced me to pick up my pen to write in reply, grumbling, I would borrow the steward's writing desk, and I would quickly return it in the vain hope of having no further need of it again. Instead of these sad papers and piles of old books, I filled my room with flowers and grasses, for I had at that time just become enthusiastic about botany, a taste for which I owed to Dr. Duvernois, and which would soon become a passion. No longer wanting to work, I needed an entertaining pastime that I liked and that would not require any more effort than an idler could happily devote to it. I decided to compose a Flora Petrinsularis, and to describe all the plants on the island, not leaving a single one out, in sufficient detail to keep me busy for the rest of my days. It is said that a German once wrote a book about a lemon rind. I could have written one on every grass in the meadows, on every moss in the woods, and on every lichen covering the rocks. In short, I wanted every single blade of grass and atom of a plant to be fully described. In order to carry out this fine plan, every morning after breakfast, which we all took together, I would set off, magnifying glass in hand and my copy of Systema Naturae under my arm, to visit a particular area of the island, which I had divided into small squares for this very purpose, intending to visit them all, one after the other, in every season. Nothing could be more extraordinary than the great joy and ecstasy I felt every time I observed something about the structure and organization of plants and about the role of the sexual parts in the process of fertilization, which was at that time completely new to me. The distinctions between groups of plants, about which I had previously had no idea, fascinated me as I examined common species and anticipated moving on to rarer ones. The forking of the self-heel's two long stamens, the springiness of those of the nettle and the wall pellitory, the way the fruit of the balsam and the fruit capsule of the box burst open, and the 1,000 little tricks of fertilization which I was observing for the first time filled me with joy, and I went about asking people if they had seen the horns of the self-heel, just as La Fontaine asked if they had read Habakkuk. After 2 or 3 hours, I would come back, laden with ample harvest, enough to keep me amused at home in the afternoon, should it rain. I spent the rest of the morning with the steward, his wife, and Thérèse, visiting their workers and their harvest, more often than not lending a hand, and often people from Bern who came to see me would find me atop a tall tree with a sack tied round my waist, which I would fill with fruit before lowering to the ground on the end of a rope. My morning exercise and the good mood it invariably put me in made it very pleasant to have a relaxing lunch. But if it went on for too long and the fine weather was enticing me, I could not bear waiting, and while the others were still at the table, I would slip away and get in a boat all alone, which I would row out to the middle of the lake when it was calm, and there, stretching out full length in the boat, my eyes looking up to the sky, I would let myself float and drift slowly wherever the water took me, sometimes for several hours at a time, plunged in 1,000 vague but delightful reveries, which, although they did not have any clear or constant subject, I always found 100 times preferable to all the sweetest things I had enjoyed in what are known as the pleasures of life. Often alerted by the setting sun to the fact that it was time to head home, I would find myself so far from the island that I was forced to row with all my strength to get back before nightfall. On other occasions, instead of heading off in the middle of the lake, I enjoyed staying close to the green shores of the island, where the limpid water and cool shade often tempted me to bathe. But one of my most frequent trips was to go from the large island to the small one, to disembark and to spend the afternoon there, sometimes taking very short walks amidst the pussy willows, alder blackthorns, persicarias, and shrubs of all varieties, sometimes setting myself on top of a sandy hillock covered with grass, wild thyme, and flowers, even including sainfoin and clover that had presumably been sown there in the past, and that were very suitable for rabbits, which could multiply there in peace, with nothing to fear and without harming anything. I put the idea to the steward, who had male and female rabbits brought over from Neuchâtel, and his wife, one of his sisters, Thérèse, and I went with great ceremony to introduce them onto the little island, where they started breeding before I had left, and where they will no doubt have thrived, as long as they have been able to survive the harsh winters. Establishing this little colony was a real celebration. The pilot of the Argonauts was no prouder than I was as I triumphantly led the people and the rabbits from the large island to the small one, and I was gratified to see that the steward's wife, who had a morbid fear of water and who always got sick in a boat, embarked confidently with me in charge and showed no sign of fear during the crossing. When the lake was too rough to let me go out in a boat, I would spend my afternoon crisscrossing the island, collecting plants as I went, stopping to sit sometimes in the most beautiful and secluded little spots to dream there at leisure, sometimes on the terraces and hillocks to enjoy the superb and spectacular view over the lake and its shores, on the one side crowned by the nearby mountains, on the other giving way to rich and fertile plains, over which the view extended as far as the distant bluish mountains. As evening approached, I would come down from the heights of the island, and I liked to go and sit at the lakeside in some secluded spot on the shingle. There, the sound of the waves and the movement of the water, gripping my senses and ridding my soul of all other agitation, plunged it into a delicious reverie, in the course of which night often fell without my noticing and took me by surprise. The ebb and flow of the water and its continuous yet constantly varying sound, ever breaking against my ears and my eyes, took the place of the movements inside me that reverie did away with, and were enough to make me pleasantly aware of my existence, without my having to take the trouble to think. From time to time, there came to mind some slight and brief reflection on the instability of the world, the image of which I saw in the surface of the water. But soon these fragile impressions faded away before the steadiness and the continuous movement which lulled me and which, without my soul actively doing anything, kept me transfixed. So much so that, when time and the agreed signal called me home, I struggled to tear myself away. After supper, when the evening was fine, we would all go out for a walk on the terrace to breathe in the coolness of the air off the lake. We would relax in the summer house, laugh, talk, sing some old song, which was just as good as the excessively complicated modern ones, and finally go off to bed, happy with the day that had passed and wishing only for the next day to be similar. Apart from the unexpected and tiresome visits I sometimes received, this is how I spent my time on the island during my stay there. I wish I knew what was so attractive about it, that it should stir in my heart regrets that are so deep, so tender, and so lasting, that 15 years later, I still find it impossible to think about this dear place without each time feeling myself transported there by pangs of longing. I have noticed, however, in the ups and downs of a long life, that it is not the memory of the periods of the sweetest joys and keenest pleasures that draws me and touches me the most. These brief moments of madness and passion, however intense they may be, are, precisely because of their very intensity, only ever scattered points along the line of our life. They are too rare and too fleeting to constitute a proper state of being, and the happiness that my heart longs for is not made up of short-lived moments, but of a simple and lasting state, which has nothing intense about it in itself, but which is all the more charming because it lasts, so much so that it finally offers the height of happiness. Everything on earth is in a state of constant flux. Nothing keeps the same fixed shape, and our affections, which are attached to external things, like them necessarily pass and change. Always beyond or behind us, they remind us of the past which is no longer, or anticipate the future which is often not to be. There is nothing solid in them for the heart to become attached to. Thus the pleasure that we enjoy in this world is almost always transitory. I suspect it is impossible to find any lasting happiness at all. Hardly is there a single moment, even in our keenest pleasures, when our heart can truly say to us, "If only this moment would last forever." And how is it possible to give the name happiness to a fleeting state which still leaves our heart anxious and empty, and which makes us regret something beforehand and long for something afterwards? But if there is a state where the soul can find a position solid enough to allow it to remain there entirely and gather together its whole being, without needing to recall the past or encroach upon the future, where time is nothing to it, where the present lasts forever, albeit imperceptibly and giving no sign of its passing, with no other feeling of deprivation or enjoyment, pleasure or pain, desire or fear than simply that of our existence, a feeling that completely fills our soul. As long as the state lasts, the person who is in it can call himself happy, not with an imperfect, poor, and relative happiness such as one finds in the pleasures of life, but with a sufficient, perfect, and full happiness, which leaves in the soul no void needing to be filled. Such is the state in which I often found myself on the Île de Saint-Pierre in my solitary reveries. Whether I was lying in my boat as it drifted wherever the water took it, or sitting on the banks of the choppy lake, or elsewhere beside a beautiful river on a stream gurgling over the stones. What does one enjoy in such a situation? Nothing external to the self. Nothing but oneself and one's own existence. As long as the state lasts, one is self-sufficient like God. The feeling of existence stripped of all other affections is in itself a precious feeling of contentment and peace, which alone would be enough to make this existence prized and cherished by anyone who could banish all the sensual and earthly pleasures which constantly distract us from it and upset the joy of it in this world. But most men, being constantly stirred by passion, know little of the state, and having only ever experienced it imperfectly and briefly, they have only a vague and confused idea of it, which gives them no sense of its charm. It would not even be good in the present circumstances for them, avidly desiring these sweet ecstasies, to take a dislike to the active life which their constantly recurring needs impose upon them. But an unfortunate man, who has been cut off from human society, and who can no longer do anything useful or good in this world, either for others or for himself, may find in this state compensation for human joys, which neither fortune nor men could take away from him. It is true that such compensations cannot be felt by every soul or in every situation. The heart must be at peace and its calm untroubled by passion. The person who experiences them must be suitably disposed to them, as must all the surrounding objects. There must be neither total calm nor too much agitation, but a steady and moderate movement with neither jolts nor pauses. Without movement, life is but lethargy. If the movement is irregular or too violent, it rouses us. By reminding us about the surrounding objects, it destroys the charm of the reverie, tears us out of ourselves, immediately puts us back beneath the yoke of fortune and men, and makes us aware of our misfortunes again. Absolute silence leads to sadness. It offers an image of death. So the help of a cheerful imagination is necessary and comes quite naturally to those whom heaven has blessed with it. The movement which does not come from outside is created within us on such occasions. There is less rest, it is true, but it is also more agreeable when light and pleasant ideas simply brush the surface of the soul, as it were, without stirring up its depths. One needs just enough of such ideas to remember oneself while forgetting all one's woes. This kind of reverie can be experienced wherever one can be quiet, and I have often thought that in the Bastille, or even in a dungeon with nothing to look at, I could still have dreamed pleasantly. But admittedly, this happened more easily and more pleasantly on a fertile and isolated island, naturally closed off and separated from the rest of the world, where nothing but cheerful images came to me, where nothing recalled sad memories, where the company of the small number of inhabitants was attractive and enjoyable without being so interesting as to take up all my time, where I could, in short, devote myself all day, unhindered and carefree, to the pastimes of my liking, or to the most languid idleness. The opportunity was undoubtedly a fine one for a dreamer who, capable of living on agreeable fantasies in the midst of the most unpleasant objects, could take his fill of them at leisure by adding to them everything which actually struck his senses. Emerging from a long and happy reverie, and finding myself surrounded by greenery, flowers, and birds, and letting my eyes wander into the distance over the romantic shores bordering a vast stretch of clear and crystalline water, I absorbed into my fictions all these delightful objects, and finding myself at last gradually brought back to myself and my surroundings, I could not distinguish between fiction and reality. So much did everything combine to make so dear to me the meditative and solitary life I led in that beautiful place. If it could only happen again. If I could only go and end my days on that beloved island, never to leave it again, nor see any inhabitants of the mainland who might remind me of the calamities of all kinds which they have delighted in piling upon me for so many years. They would soon be forgotten forever. They would not forget me in the same way, of course, but what would it matter to me, so long as they should not be able to come and disturb my peace? Freed from all the earthly passions that the tumult of social life gives rise to, my soul would often soar beyond this atmosphere and would commune before its time with the celestial spirits whose number it hopes soon to increase. Men will, I know, refuse to give me back such a dear refuge, where they did not want to leave me. But at least they will not stop me from transporting myself there every day on the wings of my imagination, and tasting for a few hours the same pleasure as if I were still living there. The sweetest thing I would do there would be to dream at my leisure. By dreaming that I am there, am I not doing that very thing? I am in fact doing more. To the attraction of an abstract and monotonous reverie, I am able to add charming images which enliven it. The objects of these images often eluded my senses in my ecstasies, and now, the deeper my reverie is, the more vividly it presents them to me. I am often more in their midst and more pleasurably so than I was when I was really there. My misfortune is that as my imagination wanes, this happens with greater difficulty and for shorter periods of time. Alas, it is when one is beginning to leave behind one's mortal body that one is the most hindered by it. And just to finish off with a living writer, John Berger, a poem called Distance. You have filled the thermos with coffee, packed our footprints if needed to throw into the jaws of the untestifying eternal snow. Together as carpenters with hammers, we have taught the distance how to build a roof from the trees we run between. In the silence behind, we no more hear the faraway question of the summer house. And tomorrow, where shall we go? At dusk, the harnessed dogs fear there is no end to the forest. And each night in the snow, we calm them with our surprising laughter. Thank you very much for listening.